That gala night, the unexpected tore through the veil of hypocrisy. Joe, a frail and orphaned boy, stormed into the party with sharp words, accusing his stepmother of being a murderer, the same woman who was now plotting his demise. No one expected the boy to have such courage to expose such dark secrets, but what he revealed was only the beginning of a twist that would change everything. Joe grew up like a small island in an ocean of silence. Since losing his mother, the house, although filled with luxury, couldn't shelter the warmth of a family. William, his father, was a broken man, consumed by grief and incapable of finding the words to comfort his son. What remained between them was a coexistence marked by knowing glances and long nights where Joe could hear his father's heavy breathing echoing through the empty hallways. There were days when Joe would seek refuge in the garden, near the swing where his mother used to sing to him. The memory of her voice was a balm, but also a constant reminder of the loss. He wanted to be strong for his father but didn't know how to fill the void that seemed to grow each day. William, for his part, tried, but his attempts came with a distant look, as if standing on the edge of a precipice. Vivian's arrival was like a breath of fresh air in the gray monotony. At 9 years old, Joe hoped that this woman with a radiant smile would bring something new, something that might save his father. But deep down, there was something about Vivian that made his heart race, not with excitement, but with an almost irrational fear. He ignored the feeling because he wanted to believe in what he saw. In the beginning, Vivian was everything William seemed to need. She made him laugh, filled the silences with enchanting stories, and at the same time, knew exactly how to make Joe feel uneasy. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to an outsider, but Joe felt the weight of a gaze that seemed to pierce him, as if she could see his deepest secrets. Vivian's behavior shifted when William wasn't around. With Joe, her kindness turned into coldness, and her smiles into intimidating silences. He began to notice that despite all the attention William received, there was something deeply wrong about her presence. Joe wanted to tell his father, but every attempt was stifled by the thought that he wouldn't be believed. The nights were the worst. Joe woke up scared, dreaming of shadows that seemed to roam the house. He imagined his mother there, protecting him, but when he opened his eyes, all he saw was the empty ceiling. Fear became a constant companion, fueled by the presence now ruling the house. Still, he tried to keep his head high, even if it took more strength than he thought he had. One day, watching Vivian embrace his father with an almost theatrical tenderness, Joe felt a pang of anguish. It wasn't jealousy, it was something deeper, a feeling that he was about to lose everything that remained. He didn't yet understand what it meant, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Joe found some comfort in his room, where he kept small objects that belonged to his mother. They were like talismans, an attempt to preserve what connected him to her memory. He would look at them before sleeping, hoping they could protect him from something he couldn't even define. On those lonely nights, the desire to become stronger grew silently. Behind Vivian's facade, Joe began to see fragments of something darker. It wasn't just the way she ignored him or her furtive glances. It was something in her gestures, in the way she seemed to study everything around her as if she had a meticulous plan. It made Joe feel smaller, like he was trapped in an invisible web only he could see. He wanted to be heard, but every attempt seemed useless. The house, which had once been merely silent, now seemed to suffocate him with a weight he couldn't explain. Joe knew something had to change, but at only 9 years old, the world seemed too big, and he too small to make any difference. What he didn't know was that destiny was about to push him into something he had never imagined facing. Vivian seemed to have an almost magical ability to mask her true self. In front of William, she was the perfect companion, the woman who brought back the smiles he had buried along with his pain. But when Joe's father wasn't around, she transformed. Her sharp gaze and calculated words were like small needles, pricking the boy's confidence until he no longer knew what was real. Joe began to realize that Vivian wasn't just cruel, she was dangerous. One day, entering the kitchen, he saw her putting something into a small vial with a smile that chilled his spine. That scene, so quick and seemingly mundane, etched itself into his mind. He tried to tell his father what he had seen, but William, so enchanted by her, didn't want to listen. "You're imagining things, son," he said, not even looking away from Vivian. It was hard for Joe to know what to do. He was only 9, but the sense of danger was so strong that he began spying on Vivian whenever he could. Sometimes he felt like a detective, other times, like a mouse trying to escape a cat. She seemed to know when he was watching because she always caught him off guard with a smile that was anything but kind. "Too much curiosity can be dangerous, you know, Joe," she once said, her tone unmistakably threatening. The tension between the two grew, but Vivian was too clever to leave clear traces. The humiliations she inflicted on Joe were subtle, small words that seemed innocent to anyone but him. She said his father was tired of his dependence, that he needed to be stronger, more independent. Over time, Joe began to doubt himself. What if she was right? What if he really was just a burden in William's life? The nights when Vivian and William spent time together in the study were especially distressing. Joe, sitting at the top of the stairs, listened to their muffled laughter and felt his stomach churn. He knew something was wrong but had no way to prove it. It was as if he were trapped in a nightmare where no one believed him, no matter how loud he screamed. This helplessness only made his fear of losing the little he still had grow. Fear began to turn into suspicion. Joe started to remember small details. Vivian's smile on the day his father first fell ill, the way she seemed to know exactly when to step in to comfort him. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but Joe didn't know how to put them together. The sense of confusion was overwhelming. He was alone, a child trying to navigate the adult world, and the weight of it was almost unbearable. One day, while helping his father find a book in the library, Joe found his mother's diary. Flipping through the worn pages, he came across a highlighted phrase, "Trust your intuition, even when the world doesn't believe you." It echoed in his mind like a call. For the first time, he felt that perhaps his intuition wasn't just fear but a real warning. He needed to listen to that voice, no matter how frightening it was. From that moment on, Joe began paying even closer attention. He wrote down everything he saw, like a little detective building a dossier. It was the only way he felt he had any control over the situation. But what he didn't realize was that, while he was investigating Vivian, she was also watching him. His movements didn't go unnoticed, and that only increased the danger. Vivian started leaving small clues that she knew what he was doing. A vial of poison strategically left in plain sight, a casual comment about how curious children always get themselves into trouble. Joe felt like he was playing a game he didn't fully understand, and every wrong move could be fatal. But he didn't give up. Something inside him told him he needed to keep going, even though fear was consuming him. And then came the final blow. William fell gravely ill, and Joe had no doubt who was to blame. He tried to warn his father, but William was too weak to listen. Joe knew he was alone in this fight, and the weight of it was crushing him. Yet, even in the confusion and fear, a seed of determination began to grow. He didn't know how, but he promised himself he would find a way to expose Vivian before it was too late. Joe tried every way he could to alert his father. He used hurried words and restless gestures, but nothing seemed to break through the wall Vivian had built around William. Every time he tried to say something, Vivian was nearby, wearing a complacent smile, gently touching William's shoulder, and murmuring something to distract him. "See how sensitive he is," she would say, as if justifying the boy's anguish. Joe felt invisible, even while screaming. Joe's desperation only grew. He began doubting himself, questioning if it was possible that everything was just a figment of his imagination. But the pieces didn't fit, and the sense that something terrible was about to happen wouldn't leave him. Every time he tried to explain to his father what he saw, William sighed and hugged him, saying, "You've got such a vivid imagination, my boy. Everything's fine." But it wasn't, and Joe knew it. Vivian became bolder in her manipulations. She made sure to undo Joe's efforts without appearing openly cruel. When he drew something for his father, she hid it. When he tried to spend time with William, she invented excuses to keep them apart. Joe felt the ground opening beneath his feet, as if the little he had was being ripped away from him. He didn't know what to do other than watch, frustrated, as Vivian wove her web. The orphanage became a looming threat, a weapon Vivian wielded like an invisible sword. In heated arguments, she would suggest that Joe was a burden, an obstacle to William's happiness. "Don't you think he'd be better off with people who know how to handle children like him?" she whispered to his father. Hidden behind the door, Joe's heart broke. The idea of being abandoned was as terrifying as Vivian's presence in their lives. One night, while William lay bedridden and Vivian cared for him with theatrical zeal, Joe summoned the courage for one final attempt. He sat by his father's side and, with tears in his eyes, begged him to trust him. "She's not who you think she is," Joe said, his heart pounding. William shook his head, exhausted, and told him to go rest. From the corner of the room, Vivian smiled as if she already knew she had won. The feeling of helplessness began to eat away at Joe from the inside. He wanted to believe he could still change something, but he was just a boy, alone in a world where no one seemed to listen. He missed his mother, who always knew what to say to make him feel safe. Now, her words seemed to echo in his mind, but without the strength to ease his anguish. The loneliness was unbearable. The days that followed were a spiral of despair. Joe watched his father wither away while Vivian remained flawless, smiling at the guests who came to offer their condolences. He wanted to scream, but every attempt to alert someone was met with pitying or skeptical looks. "He's just a child, he must be confused," they would say, while Vivian played the role of the concerned stepmother. Joe began to understand that he was truly alone. Despite everything, Joe kept trying. He searched the cupboards, looking for evidence he could use to expose Vivian, but she always seemed one step ahead. One day, he found a hidden vial, but before he could show it to anyone, Vivian appeared. She calmly took the vial from his hand and said, "Curious boys always end up in trouble." Joe knew she was serious. The frustration of not being heard began to turn into something darker. Joe felt anger, an anger he didn't know how to contain. He wanted justice, he wanted to save his father. But time was running out, and Vivian seemed invincible. He started to feel that maybe there was nothing he could do, and that terrified him. It was like being caught in a current, swept toward a fate he couldn't escape. Joe didn't know how, but he promised himself he would do something. Even if no one believed him, even if the whole world refused to listen, he would find a way to fight. His mother's words continued to echo. The truth always finds a way to prevail. He didn't know how to trust them, but he couldn't let them go. They were the only thread of hope he could cling to. Sitting on the edge of his bed, Joe held his mother's diary with trembling hands. The worn pages carried the scent of a happier time, and the words written inside seemed to whisper directly to him. "Trust your intuition, even when the world doesn't believe you." He read that phrase over and over, feeling a small spark ignite within him. It wasn't much, but it was something, and he needed it to keep going. Joe began to find strength in the memory of his mother. He remembered how she always said that every person carries an inner light, even in the darkest moments. Though the pain of her absence was a constant weight, the memory of her voice and her advice offered a kind of comfort. Joe started to realize that even alone, he had something powerful, the truth. And he believed this could be his weapon against Vivian. With a quiet determination, Joe decided he could no longer wait for someone to save him. He needed to save himself and his father while there was still time. Inspired by his mother's words, he began to write down everything he noticed. Small gestures, suspicious looks, details that went unnoticed by the adults. It was as though he was piecing together a puzzle, even if he didn't yet know what the final image would be. Vivian, however, seemed to sense this change in him. Her provocations became more frequent, more cutting. "Do you think anyone will believe you?" she whispered, always with that smile that seemed to slice his confidence to shreds. But this time, Joe didn't back down. He was beginning to understand that fear was her most powerful weapon, and he couldn't let it control him anymore. The turning point came when Joe noticed Vivian acting even more calculated. He overheard hushed phone conversations and saw suspicious objects carefully hidden away. Something was being planned, and the certainty of it burned in his mind like a constant alarm. Joe knew he needed to prepare to act, but he wasn't sure how. It was as though he was racing against time without a map or compass. Drawing courage from the strength he seemed to inherit from his mother, Joe began to plan. He knew he couldn't confront Vivian directly, not yet, but he could get ready. He thought of the stories his mother used to read to him, about heroes facing much bigger enemies. He knew he didn't have physical strength, but he had intelligence and now, something even more important, a purpose. Joe started gathering evidence. He took photographs of suspicious objects, secretly recorded conversations, and stored everything in a notebook he hid under his mattress. It was a dangerous game, and he knew it, but whenever fear threatened to overwhelm him, he repeated his mother's words, "The truth always finds a way to prevail." That phrase became a mantra, a shield against the fear trying to consume his courage. His mother's diary also became his confidant. He wrote in it every night, pouring out his anxieties and his plans. It was a small act, but it made him feel like she was still with him in some way. He promised himself that he wouldn't let his father's sacrifice, or his mother's memory, be in vain. He would fight even if the whole world insisted on doubting him. While Vivian believed Joe was weakened, he was actually growing stronger. Each day spent in the silence of his room was another step toward the confrontation he knew was coming. He still didn't know how, but he was determined to find a way to expose Vivian. His determination burned like a flame that refused to go out, even in the midst of the storm. Joe's resolve, fueled by his mother's words and the love he still felt for his father, became the light that guided him. He knew the road would be dangerous, but he also knew he couldn't give up. "You're stronger than you think, Joe," his mother used to say. And now he was beginning to believe it. William's death came like a storm, ripping away what little stability Joe had left. He was there, by his father's bedside, holding his cold hand as the heart of the man he loved most took its final breath. Vivian stood nearby, sobbing theatrically, but her eyes held no genuine sadness. Joe saw it, and in that moment he knew for certain she was responsible. In the days that followed, the house became a place of desolation and fear. Lawyers came and went, settling the inheritance, while Vivian played the role of the grieving widow. Joe, however, was treated like a ghost, someone whose presence was merely tolerated. "You can't stay here, Joe. It's not healthy for either of us," Vivian said sharply, shortly after the funeral. Her words fell like daggers on the boy's heart. Joe tried to confront her. He stood before her in the living room, his face streaked with tears, and said, "You killed my father." "I know it was you." Vivian laughed, a cold and empty sound that made him shiver. "No one will believe you, Joe. You're just a child with too much imagination," she replied before turning and leaving the room, abandoning him to his anguish. Every day in the house became a silent battle. Joe watched as Vivian rearranged everything, erasing all traces of his father. William's portraits vanished from the walls, replaced by modern, impersonal artwork. The memories Joe desperately tried to preserve were being destroyed before his eyes. "This house needs a refresh," Vivian would say casually, as if she were discussing something trivial, not the home Joe had loved. The breaking point came when Vivian brought in lawyers to discuss Joe's future. He listened, hidden behind the door, as she explained that the boy would be sent to an orphanage. "He needs care I can't provide," she said in a syrupy voice that masked her true intention, to rid herself of him forever. Joe felt the ground disappear beneath him. He ran to his room, tears streaming as he clutched his mother's diary like a shield against the world. The departure was brutal. Without ceremony, Vivian ordered a driver to take Joe to the orphanage. She didn't even say goodbye. She simply watched from the door, wearing a vague smile that said more than words ever could. "Be strong, Joe. Maybe this will teach you something," were her last, sarcastic words before shutting the door and turning away. Joe watched out the car window as the house he had grown up in became just a speck on the horizon. In that moment, Joe vowed to himself that he would return. He didn't know how, but he swore that Vivian wouldn't go unpunished. Despite the fear and sadness that overwhelmed him, there was a spark of determination inside him that refused to die. She thought she had won, but Joe knew the fight was only beginning. The orphanage was cold, both in its structure and in its spirit. The gray walls seemed to drain any trace of joy the children might have brought with them. Joe was dropped off unceremoniously, clutching a small suitcase and his mother's diary pressed against his chest. The driver's farewell was curt, and Vivian's complete absence made the abandonment all the more cruel. Joe felt the weight of his loneliness as he never had before. The first days were the hardest. Joe was just another child among many, each carrying their own story of pain. He tried to keep to himself, but there was no escaping the curious stares or invasive questions from the other boys. "Why are you here? Where are your parents?" He didn't answer. He just lowered his head and sought solace in the pages of his mother's diary. The orphanage's rules were strict. Days began early, filled with endless chores. Joe washed dishes, scrubbed floors, and did whatever was needed to avoid drawing attention. He learned to survive in that hostile environment but never felt a part of it. At night, when the noise of the other children faded, he lay staring at the ceiling, trying to find the strength to keep going. However, the determination he had cultivated in Vivian's house didn't abandon him. During the months he spent in the orphanage, Joe began to plan. He wrote small reminders to himself, phrases his mother used to say, and mentally reviewed everything he knew about Vivian. He knew she wouldn't stop with his father's death. People like her never stopped. He had to be ready for when the opportunity to act arose. It was on a stifling afternoon that Joe overheard something that would change everything. Two orphanage employees were talking near the kitchen, their voices filled with curiosity and gossip. "Did you hear about that rich widow, Vivian? Apparently, she's engaged again. The guy's a millionaire, some Richard guy. She sure knows how to pick them, doesn't she?" Joe froze where he stood, his heart pounding erratically. Richard. Vivian was starting another scheme. Joe could barely contain the avalanche of thoughts flooding his mind. If she had her sights set on Richard, it could only mean one thing: he was her next victim. The thought filled him with rage but also steeled his resolve. He had to act before something happened. No matter how hard it would be, he couldn't allow Vivian to ruin another life. The following weeks were a mix of planning and anticipation. Joe began observing every detail about the orphanage's operations, looking for weaknesses he could exploit to escape. He knew the outside world would be dangerous, but that didn't matter. What mattered was stopping Vivian and exposing the truth about what she had done to his father. On a moonless night, Joe put his plan into action. With his mother's diary and a few clothes stuffed into a backpack, he slipped out of the orphanage, unnoticed by the monitors. Each step he took was filled with fear but also with a glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew the journey would be long and fraught with challenges, but he was ready. For the first time, he wasn't just a lost child. He was someone with a purpose. As he walked through the deserted streets, Joe repeated his mother's words to himself: "The truth always finds a way to prevail." He didn't know how he would face Vivian, but he knew he had to start somewhere. Joe arrived in the city with more questions than answers, but he carried a determination that felt larger than himself. The shop windows glowed like promises, but reality was far less welcoming. At only 9 years old, he blended into the crowd, trying to go unnoticed as he plotted his next move. His goal was clear: to find Richard and tell him what he knew about Vivian. But he also knew it wouldn't be easy. Who would believe a boy like him? Life on the streets was harsh, but Joe had grown used to surviving. He learned quickly, observing people and doing whatever he could to avoid drawing attention. His only solace was his mother's diary, which he read every night, finding strength in her words. Between pages, he planned how he might approach Richard. But the truth was, without concrete information, it all felt like a shot in the dark. One day, in a cafe where he was hiding in a corner with the little money he had managed to scrounge, Joe overheard a conversation that ignited a spark of hope. Two men were talking about a grand gala organized by Richard and his fiancée. "It's going to be the party of the year," they said, laughing as they described the luxurious event. Joe knew instantly that this was his chance. If Vivian would be there, he needed to be there too. With the gala's date etched in his mind, Joe began crafting a plan. He needed to infiltrate the event unnoticed, which wouldn't be easy for a boy with no money or proper clothes. Over the following nights, he observed the venue where the party would take place, studying the movements of the staff, the entrances and exits, and any detail he could use to his advantage. It was a game of patience and courage. On the day of the gala, Joe found his opportunity. Dressed in clothes borrowed from a young man who sympathized with his story, he waited until a group of waiters entered the hall. Seizing the moment, he slipped in among them, holding an empty tray to blend in. Every step he took inside the luxurious hall was a battle against the fear of being discovered. But he knew he had to be brave. The hall was filled with people laughing and chatting, their voices echoing under the brilliance of crystal chandeliers. At the center of it all stood Vivian, radiant in a dress as fake as her smile. Beside her was Richard, tall and confident, seemingly blind to the dangers surrounding him. Joe watched from a distance, trying to control the lump in his throat. He knew he had to act, but fear was paralyzing. Finally, Joe summoned the courage he had been building for months. He crossed the room, ignoring the curious stares, and stopped in front of Vivian and Richard. "She's a murderer," he shouted, his voice echoing across the hall. "She killed my father, and she's going to do the same to you." For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The guests stared in shock, and Vivian, her expression as if she had just been struck, tried to maintain her composure. Vivian reacted quickly, laughing condescendingly. "This boy is crazy. Someone get him out of here," she said, placing a hand on Richard's arm and feigning concern. But Joe didn't give up. He kept speaking, even as security approached. He revealed everything he knew, every detail he had gathered, planting a seed of doubt in Richard. Joe didn't know if it would be enough, but it was his only chance. Before being dragged away by security, Joe looked directly into Richard's eyes. "Please, investigate. You don't know what she's capable of," he pleaded, his words heavy with desperation and truth, echoing in the silence that filled the room. As he was pulled outside, he saw Vivian's expression harden, a mix of fury and fear that made him believe he might have taken the first step. Outside, in the cold night, Joe sat on the curb, exhausted but with a strange sense of relief. He had done everything he could, and now all he could do was wait. Deep down, he knew the battle was far from over. Vivian was dangerous, and he needed to be prepared for what was to come. But for the first time in a long while, he felt he wasn't entirely alone. Richard had listened, and that could change everything. Joe didn't know if his boldness at the gala had any effect, but the seed of hope planted in Richard began to grow. Days later, as he wandered the streets searching for shelter, he was startled by a black car that pulled up beside him. The window rolled down, revealing Richard's serious yet curious face. "You're Joe, right? The boy from the party?" His voice was deep, but there was something in it. Perhaps doubt, perhaps curiosity. Joe nodded, surprised and nervous. Moved by the boy's words and a nagging feeling he couldn't ignore, Richard decided to give Joe a chance to explain. He took him to a small cafe, where he ordered 2 hot chocolates. Joe told his story, hesitant at first but then with the intensity of someone desperate to be heard. Every detail of what he had lived, from his mother's death to the day he was sent to the orphanage, spilled from his lips, a mix of anguish and determination. As he listened, Richard began recalling small details he had ignored about Vivian, moments when she seemed to know more than she should, inconsistent stories about her past. Joe's words opened a door Richard hadn't realized was there, and the discomfort grew. "Do you have any proof of what you're saying?" he asked, trying to remain composed. Joe pulled out his mother's diary and some notes he had kept over the months. "This is all I have." Reading the diary's words and Joe's notes felt like piecing together a dark puzzle. Richard didn't know what to believe, but something in his intuition made him hesitate. He decided not to confront Vivian directly but to investigate on his own. "You're not lying, are you?" he asked, looking into the boy's eyes. "No," Joe replied, his voice firm yet tinged with vulnerability that was impossible to ignore. Richard made a decision in that moment. He brought Joe to his home, a safe place away from Vivian's watchful eyes. "If she knows you're here, she'll try to reach you," he said, opening the mansion's doors. Joe felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He was safe for now, but he knew Vivian wouldn't give up easily. The fear remained, but now there was something new, the feeling that, finally, someone believed him. Living with Richard brought Joe moments of relief he hadn't felt in months. He had a room, clean clothes, and warm meals. But more than that, he felt heard. Richard asked questions, wanted to understand the details, and Joe no longer felt like his story was a cry lost in the void. This connection began to build a delicate trust, as if they were navigating uncertain terrain together. While Richard investigated, Joe tried to adapt to this new reality. He still carried the weight of fear, but now there was room for something else: determination. He knew Vivian wouldn't stand still. "She's always one step ahead," he would tell Richard, who nodded, lost in thought. The idea that both of them were in danger grew stronger each day, but it only fueled their resolve to fight back. The following days were a mix of tension and preparation. Richard used his influence to discreetly gather information. He spoke to people who knew Vivian, analyzed suspicious financial transactions, and slowly began to see the pattern Joe had described. Each new discovery was a silent confirmation that the boy was telling the truth. And with that, the urgency to act grew. One evening, as Joe stared at the stars in the garden, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: a thread of genuine hope. He knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time, he didn't feel completely alone. Richard sat beside him, offering a blanket. "You're stronger than you think, kid," he said with a faint smile. Joe looked at him and replied, "I had to be." The bond between them gave Joe a new kind of strength. He was still a child, but he began to understand that he didn't have to face everything alone. Richard, in turn, felt the weight of responsibility to protect this boy who had lost so much. They didn't know exactly how they would handle Vivian, but one thing was clear: they were in this battle together, and that made all the difference. The night fell heavily over Richard's mansion, the silence broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. Joe was in his room, reviewing his notes and thinking about their next steps. Richard, meanwhile, was in his study, poring over documents that unraveled more of Vivian's dark past. Both were deeply focused, unaware that danger was rapidly closing in. Vivian wasn't the type to leave loose ends. Vivian had escaped the hospital where she was under custody after Richard had switched their drinks at the gala, forcing her to ingest her own poison. Recovered but furious, she knew exactly where to find Joe. With a plan as meticulous as her manipulations, she bypassed the limited security measures Richard had arranged. Under the cover of night, she infiltrated the mansion, bringing with her an ominous energy that seemed to drain the air from the place. Joe was the first to sense something was wrong. He heard the faint creak of a door and felt a chill run down his spine. Cautiously, he left his room and began descending the stairs, his bare feet making almost no sound. When he reached the living room, he saw Vivian standing in the center of the room, her gaze a mix of rage and disdain. "You never learn, do you, boy?" she said, her voice icy. Panic surged through Joe, but he forced himself to stay firm. Richard appeared moments later, alarmed by the noise. He stopped upon seeing Vivian, his expression hardening. "Vivian, it's over." "I know everything," he said, his voice firm but controlled. She only laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the room. "Over? You think you can destroy me with this kid and a few suspicions? You have no idea what I'm capable of." The tension in the room was palpable, the air charged with electricity. The confrontation that followed was filled with terror and fury. In a desperate attempt to regain control, Vivian lunged at Joe, but Richard stepped between them. The ensuing struggle was chaotic and frightening. Joe watched in horror as Vivian struck Richard with a heavy object, sending him to the ground. For a moment, Joe thought he had lost him. The terror paralyzed him, but the anger that followed propelled him into action. With a courage he didn't know he possessed, Joe grabbed his mother's diary from a nearby table and shouted at Vivian, "You won't get away this time." He threw the book at her, not as a weapon, but as a reminder of what she had done. Surprisingly, this made her hesitate for a moment, long enough for Richard, though injured, to get back on his feet and restrain her. The police, whom Richard had discreetly alerted during his investigation, arrived just in time. Vivian was arrested, screaming threats as she was taken away. Joe collapsed onto the floor, exhausted, while Richard, breathing heavily and clearly hurt, sat beside him. "You were incredible, kid," he said with a weak smile. Joe looked at him, a wave of relief mixed with the fear of losing him. "I thought I lost you," he confessed, tears in his eyes. As the ambulance took Richard to the hospital, Joe held his hand tightly. The gratitude he felt for Richard believing him and fighting alongside him was immense, but the fear that something might still happen to Richard consumed him. Yet, at that moment, he knew they had defeated Vivian together. The immediate danger had passed, but Joe understood that the road to healing and rebuilding would still be long. The mansion felt quieter than ever after everything was over. Joe looked around, feeling safer but also changed. He was no longer the same boy who had lost everything. Now, he was someone who had faced the unimaginable and emerged stronger. Sitting in the empty living room, he promised himself he would do everything to honor the memories of his parents and the new chance Richard had given him. Vivian had been relentless even after the confrontation at the gala. She had brushed off Joe's accusations as trivial nuisances. But Richard, determined to maintain appearances while secretly investigating, organized a new, more intimate event, hoping that proximity would reveal Vivian's true intentions. Joe, watching from a distance, knew this party might be the key to exposing her once and for all. On the night of the party, Vivian was immaculate. Her dress was elegant, her smile radiant, and she exuded confidence. Richard, however, stayed vigilant, watching her every move. He knew this might be the night she tried something drastic. All evening he stayed close to her, engaging in a subtle game of patience where every glance and gesture mattered. As the evening progressed, Richard noticed a subtle shift in Vivian's behavior. She seemed more anxious, her eyes scanning the room as if waiting for the perfect moment. Then, with a controlled smile, she led him to the bar, offering a special toast to celebrate their future together. Richard accepted the glass but, with a swift motion, switched their drinks without her noticing. Vivian drank, unaware of the switch. At first, everything seemed normal. She continued smiling, chatting with guests, and casting furtive glances at Richard, as if convinced her plan was succeeding. But gradually, the poison began to take effect. Her face paled, and she clutched her throat, trying to mask the growing discomfort. Her confident demeanor started to crack. Richard noticed the change and watched her with a cold gaze. "Vivian, are you all right?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled. She tried to respond, but the pain silenced her. By then, all eyes in the room were on her. The smile faded from Richard's face as he watched her struggle under the weight of her own scheme. The control she had so carefully maintained slipped away. Vivian tried to stand, but the poison had taken hold. Her expression of shock and rage was unmistakable. She looked at Richard, bewildered at how everything had gone so wrong. In her last conscious effort, she muttered something incomprehensible before being rushed to the hospital. Richard knew this turn of events was what he and Joe needed. She was now under custody and, finally, out of their reach. Although Vivian was hospitalized and under custody, Richard knew she was too dangerous to underestimate. Joe, witnessing everything with a mix of relief and anxiety, couldn't shake the fear that this was just a pause, not the end. He was right. A few days later, the news no one wanted to hear arrived. Vivian had escaped from the hospital. To Richard and Joe, it meant only one thing: she would be back. The atmosphere in Richard's mansion became one of constant vigilance. He increased security, but deep down, he knew Vivian always found a way to manipulate situations to her advantage. Joe spent sleepless nights listening for footsteps or the sound of something breaking. His fear was tangible, but so was his determination. "She won't defeat us," he told Richard with more conviction than he felt. Richard nodded, knowing they needed to be ready. That night, Vivian finally made her move. Exploiting a lapse in security, she entered the mansion with the precision of someone who knew every corner of the place. By the time Richard and Joe heard the first sound of breaking glass, it was already too late to stop her entry. She was there, carrying the fury of someone desperate to reclaim control of her story, no matter the cost. Joe was upstairs when he heard Vivian's voice echo through the house. "Do you really think you can destroy me? I've done this before, and I'll do it again." His heart raced as he descended the stairs, finding Vivian and Richard face to face in the grand hall. Richard, though maintaining his composure, was clearly tense. Joe knew he was still hurt but wouldn't let Vivian see it. "It's over, Vivian. You've lost," Richard said firmly. Vivian laughed, but it was an empty laugh, tinged with desperation. "Lost? You still don't understand, do you? I always win," she said, advancing toward Joe. Richard quickly stepped between them, but Vivian was ready. In a swift motion, she attacked him, knocking him to the floor. Joe screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of furniture scraping as the two struggled. It was chaos, and the terror paralyzed him. Even so, Joe knew he couldn't stand idle. He ran to the phone, but when he realized the line was cut, he remembered the cell phone Richard always kept in his pocket. With difficulty, he found the device and called the police, giving them the address and explaining the urgency of the situation. Meanwhile, in the hall, Richard struggled to fend off Vivian, who seemed consumed by a near-animalistic desperation. The police arrived quickly, though for Joe, each second felt like an eternity. When the officers entered the mansion, Vivian was on top of Richard, ready to deliver the final blow. They managed to restrain her with difficulty, handcuffing her as she screamed threats. "This isn't over. I'll be back." Joe watched, trembling as Richard was taken to an ambulance. He knew Vivian was defeated for now, but the fear that she might make good on her threats lingered. As paramedics tended to Richard, Joe felt a wave of relief mixed with exhaustion. He walked to Richard's side and held his hand. "Are you okay?" he asked, his eyes brimming with tears. Richard smiled, weak but sincere. "Now I am," he replied before being placed in the ambulance. Joe knew the immediate danger was over, but the scars of that night would stay with them for a long time. Standing at the mansion's entrance, watching the flashing lights of police cars fade into the distance, Joe took a deep breath. He knew this confrontation marked the peak of a long battle, but also the start of something new. Vivian was back in custody, and this time there were witnesses and enough evidence to ensure she wouldn't go unpunished. For the first time, Joe felt he could begin to think about a future without so much fear. The days that followed were quiet but filled with a new kind of energy. Joe was back at the mansion, not as a boy shadowed by fear, but as someone who had faced the worst and survived. Richard was recovering in the hospital, and Joe visited him daily, bringing small drawings and stories he created to keep him entertained. Each time he saw Richard smile, even faintly, he felt a sense of relief he never thought possible. Despite the temporary calm, Joe was still haunted by what had happened. He dreamed of Vivian, reliving the confrontation and feeling the fury in her eyes. But upon waking, there was something different, the certainty that, for the first time, he wasn't alone. He looked around the room where he now slept, decorated in soft colors Richard had let him choose, and felt it finally resembled a home. When Richard returned home, he was met with a hesitant but genuine hug from Joe. Still moving slowly, Richard looked at the boy and said, "You were incredible, Joe. I don't know how I'd have done this without you." The words were simple but carried an emotional weight that made Joe's throat tighten. He had always wanted to be heard, recognized, and now here was someone who saw his strength. The two began building a routine that slowly brought a sense of normalcy. Richard introduced Joe to household chores, teaching him to take care of the home and make decisions about small things like what to eat or which movie to watch. Joe, who had never felt he had a voice, began to understand what it meant to be part of something, not just a passive spectator of his own life. Every small gesture of trust from Richard was a victory for him. Day by day, Joe grew more secure. The shadows of Vivian still lingered in his mind but no longer controlled him. He knew her trial was approaching, and Richard assured him everything would be done to ensure she paid for her crimes. This certainty brought a new kind of peace to Joe, who could now begin to think about the future. For the first time, he dreamed of possibilities, not just ways to survive. One sunny afternoon, as the two were sitting in the garden, Richard turned to Joe and said something that changed everything. "I've been thinking, what if you stayed here with me officially? As my son?" Joe was silent for a moment, processing what those words meant. He had secretly wished for it but never thought it could be possible. "Do you really want that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Richard smiled and replied, "More than anything." Joe's adoption was a process filled with tears and smiles. He still remembered the day the papers were signed, and Richard placed an arm around his shoulders, saying, "Now we're officially a family." For Joe, who had lost so much, it felt like he was finally gaining something no one could take away. It was more than a document. It was the assurance that he would no longer have to fight alone. The months that followed were filled with small victories that, for Joe, were monumental. He started attending school, made friends, and discovered hobbies he had never had the chance to explore. Richard encouraged him in everything, always present but never overbearing. Their relationship grew naturally, and Joe began to see Richard as more than a protector. He was the father Joe had always needed. Life with Richard gave Joe something he didn't realize he needed: stability. For the first time in years, he woke up without the weight of imminent fear. Vivian's trial brought closure to a dark chapter. Throughout the process, Richard kept Joe by his side, explaining each step with patience. "She can't hurt you anymore," Richard told him the day the verdict was read. Vivian was sentenced to prison, and Joe finally felt the beginnings of true freedom. As the months passed, Joe began to transform. He was no longer the scared boy wandering the streets or hiding behind doors. Richard, with his constant support, helped him find his own voice. "You have so much to offer, Joe," he would say, encouraging him to join school projects and even write about his experiences. Slowly, Joe started to believe he could be more than the scars left by Vivian. One night, while organizing the house's library, Joe found his mother's diary again. Opening it, he felt her words differently this time. They were no longer just a source of comfort, they were a call to action. The truth always finds a way to prevail. He knew he couldn't change what had happened, but he could turn his pain into something greater. He spoke to Richard about it, and together they began planning a way to help other children who, like him, faced difficult circumstances. The project started small: visits to orphanages, sharing stories, and offering support. Joe sat on the floor beside the children, often recounting how he had found courage even in the darkest moments. He saw the reflection of his old pain in their eyes, but also something that drove him forward: hope. Every smile, every curious question reminded him that his journey had a purpose. Over time, Joe and Richard expanded the project. They created a foundation that provided emotional and legal support for children in vulnerable situations. Joe, still young, played a crucial role, becoming a voice for those who were often unheard. He drew strength from his own story and used it to inspire others. Richard, proud and steadfast, was always by his side, helping turn their pain into action. On Joe's 12th birthday, Richard organized a small party with friends Joe had made at school and some of the new allies they'd met through the foundation. As everyone sang "Happy Birthday," Joe looked around and felt something he'd never thought possible: belonging. He had a home, friends, and a father who loved him unconditionally. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. Joe and Richard continued building together, strengthening the bond they had forged. Joe knew the scars of his past would never fully fade, but they didn't stop him from moving forward. On the contrary, they reminded him of his strength and motivated him to help others find their own courage. Now he was certain, no matter how hard the path, he would always find a way to overcome it. As the years passed, Joe became a respected figure in his community, a living example of resilience and transformation. The foundation he and Richard had built grew, reaching places Joe had never imagined. Young people in at-risk situations now had access to emotional support, education, and opportunities that once seemed impossible. Each success of the foundation was a tribute to the hardships Joe had faced and overcome. Richard, now with grayer hair, watched with pride as Joe grew into the man he was becoming. They still shared simple moments, long talks in the garden or movie nights, that kept alive the bond that had united them during such dark times. "You've changed so many lives, Joe," Richard said one evening as they watched the sunset. Joe smiled, knowing the life he had changed the most was his own. Joe continued visiting orphanages, now not just as a survivor but as someone who could offer more than hope, a path forward. He remembered how, at the same age, he had felt invisible, crushed by a system that seemed incapable of listening. Now, he was the voice that had once been missing for so many children. Each look of gratitude he received was a reminder that his painful past had led to something extraordinary. The memories of his mother and biological father stayed with him, but now they brought comfort instead of pain. He kept his mother's diary on a special shelf, reading it during moments of reflection. "The truth always finds a way to prevail," remained his guiding mantra, but now it held an even deeper meaning. It wasn't just about exposing Vivian's secrets, it was about living his life authentically and honestly, true to his own journey. One afternoon, during the opening of a new foundation center, Joe gave a speech that deeply moved everyone present. He spoke about fear, anguish, and humiliation, but also about the strength he had discovered within himself. "We all have the power to transform our pain into something greater," he said with a steady voice. "And when we do, we not only heal ourselves but also help heal the world around us." After the event, a shy child approached Joe, clutching a small piece of paper. "Do you think I can be strong too?" she asked, her eyes filled with doubt. Joe knelt to her level and replied with a warm smile, "You already are strong. You just need to remember that." The words echoed within him, as if they were something his mother might have said, and in that moment he knew he was on the right path. Joe and Richard continued building the life they had created together. It wasn't perfect, but it was full of meaning. They learned to celebrate the small victories and face challenges with courage. Every shared laugh, every dinner conversation, was proof that love and hope could transform even the most difficult story. On the swing in the garden, where Joe had often reflected on his journey, he now sat with a serenity he had never known before. He looked at the trees swaying in the wind and felt peace. His story wasn't just about survival. It was about rebuilding, resilience, and the choice to believe in love. He had found the elixir of life, and it was simpler than he'd imagined: the power to transform pain into purpose and to live with gratitude.